Hello and welcome back to the Specialist Learning Podcast. I'm Katie Nelson, Dyslexia and Dyscalculia Specialist and founder of the Dyslexia and Dyscalculia Academy. Each month I use this space to share reflections from practice, insights from specialist work and things I see every day when supporting learners and families. The aim is always to give you something really practical to think about, something that helps you understand dyslexia and dyscalculia more deeply, and something that you can take straight into your own practice or home life. So, wherever you're listening from today, whether you're driving, having a cup of tea, or just taking that quiet moment, I'm really glad that you're here. Today I want to talk about something that has honestly changed the way I think about teaching conversations with learners. Not a programme, not an intervention, not a resource, but language. More specifically, prompts. The actual wording we use when we ask our learners questions. Because one thing I've actually become increasingly aware of over the years is how often we think we are asking one thing when actually the learner is experiencing something completely different. And this comes up constantly during assessments. Sometimes I'll ask a learner a question and there will be this pause. You can almost see them trying to organise everything that's happening in their head. And then they'll say something along the lines of, I don't know, or I'm confused, or I know it, but I can't quite explain it. And years ago, I think I probably interpreted those moments differently. I probably assumed more quickly that the learner didn't understand the concept itself. But the more time I've spent exploring learning difficulties, cognitive load, working memory and language demand, the more I've realised something really important. Sometimes the difficulty isn't the learning. Sometimes the difficulty is the pathway into showing the learning. And I think that's such an important distinction. Because quite often when we look more closely, the learner actually understands far more than first appears, really. So something I hear quite regularly during assessments is, I know it in my head, but I just can't get it onto the paper. And honestly, I think that sentence tells us so much because very often when the learner does have these ideas, the difficulty is actually managing all the processes required to express those ideas at the same time. Holding the thought in working memory, organising the language, sequencing information, managing spelling concerns, remembering the original question in the first place, and trying not to lose track halfway through. If you think about it, that's a huge amount, isn't it, that's happening simultaneously. And sometimes I actually think as professionals, we can unintentionally underestimate the hidden demands sitting underneath what seem like quite simple questions. So, for example, imagine asking a learner, why do you think the character behaved like that? Now, to us, that feels like one question. But cognitively, the learner may be needing to actually retrieve the information from the text, hold the question in mind, work out what, why requires, and organise that reasoning around it, formulate the spoken language needed, and manage the pressure of answering aloud. That's not one process in itself, is it? That is multiple processes layered together. And this is why I've become really interested in just slowing down and reflecting not only on learners' responses, but on my own wording. What did I actually ask? What was the learner genuinely being required to do in that moment? Because often our intention as tutors and professionals is very different from the cognitive demand created by the wording itself. And I think this is especially important when supporting learners with dyslexia and dyscalculia, because so many of our learners are already using enormous amounts of cognitive energy simply to stay engaged with the task. Sometimes we can actually accidentally add additional load without even realising. And this isn't about criticising ourselves as tutors, not at all. That is not what I'm getting at here. But actually, I think this kind of reflection is one of the most positive things we can do professionally, because awareness changes practice. And one thing I've noticed with tutors undertaking specialist training is that there often comes these moments where they stop focusing only on whether the learner got the answer correct and begin becoming much more curious about the learner's experience of the task itself. And that's a really important point in specialist development, that moving from, what got answered to what was happening underneath that response. And honestly, I do think some of the most useful professional reflection comes from those moments where a learner responds in a way that we didn't actually expect. So the moments where they freeze or hesitate or say, I don't know, or give a very short answer when we know they're capable of more. Because often those moments are giving us information. One thing I quite often say is that difficulty is information. And I genuinely believe that. The learner's response is telling us something about how they are experiencing the task, not just whether they know the answer. And sometimes when we slow things down and reduce the demand slightly, the understanding suddenly becomes much clearer. And I see this a lot during assessments, actually, where a learner might initially say, oh, I don't know. But then if I gently reduce the load and say, tell me anything you do know then, or let's think it through together, and then suddenly more information starts emerging. And often that's because the original prompt carried out was much of a bigger demand than we first realised. Recently, inside the Academy, we created a reflective tutor page called What Did I Actually Ask? And honestly, the reason I wanted to create it was because I think tutors sometimes move far too quickly into prompting and correcting instead of first simply just noticing them. The reflection page it's designed to help tutors just slow down, take a moment and look carefully at the wording that they're using during teaching and assessment moments. And not to perfect it, not to judge it, but to understand it. Because often there's a really important gap between our intention as tutors and the invitation to the learner of what they're actually experiencing through the wording. And one line from the resource that I really like, it says, the aim is awareness, not improvement. And I do think that is such an important reminder here. Because professional reflection does not always need to begin with fixing. Sometimes it begins with noticing. The resource as well, when you take a look, it invites tutors to write the original prompt exactly as spoken and to reflect on the hidden demands within the wording, and also to consider what assumptions might already be embedded in the question itself. And I really do think this kind of thinking becomes increasingly important the more we work with learners who are experiencing working memory difficulties, processing difficulties, and that learning anxiety as well. Because sometimes the learner is not struggling with the concept itself. That's what I'm trying to kind of get across here. Sometimes they are struggling with the volume of the simultaneous demands surrounding the concept. And once we begin seeing that more clearly, our interpretation changes, our pacing changes, Our questions around it change, and then often you'll find the learner's confidence changes too. Before we finish today, I'd like to leave you with a very small reflection. The next time a learner gives an unexpected response, or if they say to you, I don't know, or seems to lose track halfway through a particular task, just pause for a moment and just ask yourself, what was the learner actually being required to do there? Not just academically, don't just mean from that sense, but cognitively. Because often that question opens up a much deeper understanding here of what your learner is experiencing. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Hope it's given you something really practical to reflect on in your own practice or at home. And if you're listening on Spotify or another podcast platform, do make sure you check the session notes where you'll find the reflective resource linked to this episode. It's called What Did I Actually Ask? And if you're listening inside the Tutor Vault, you'll know that alongside each podcast episode, you can access a growing library of specialist tools that are designed to support learners with dyslexia and dyscalculia. If you're not inside the Tutor Vault yet and you'd like access to those resources, you can head over to www.dyslexia-academy.com. Thank you again so much for being here. And until next time, take care and keep supporting learning with understanding.